In this special video, RSGB Spectrum licensing expert Murray Niman, G6JYB, will explain what Ofcom is proposing in the biggest revamp of amateur radio licensing and call sign policy in a generation. It's part of the RSGB's wider guidance for radio amateurs on this consultation. Welcome, Murray.
Thank you, David. So in my role, so the word says spectrum. We also deal with licensing and a number of other regulatory and international matters. So this topic is sort of falls into my area along with my colleagues. So Ofcom have very recently released first their plan of work for this year, and then most recently their consultation in 23rd of June. This covers not just the license conditions itself, but the wider framework, and that's quite unusual. We've got some time to reply by 4th of September, and the key link for finding either our guidance or handy links to Ofcom's own website is on screen there at RSGB.org license review. One thing we would like to stress at this early point is all radio amateurs are encouraged to read the consultation and to reply to Ofcom individually. Please, no, RSGB will clearly do its own reply, but please don't assume that we'll do it all for you, and don't just put in copycat replies. Individual ones do count more in the way they assess these. Right, in terms of where this has come from, some of you may remember that the current lifetime license was, as it's sometimes called, was introduced nominally around about 2006 and replaced a much more historic document called BR68. Since then, there have been relatively modest changes. The first was in 2015, where some of the frequency schedule changed. And then there was Ofcom's first attempt to either amend or reset the way regional secondary locators worked. That although they retreated on that, this is one topic that's returned in this one. The other much more recent change, which did worry some people, but there's now a lot of assistance for, is the EMF clause, where you had to assess your antenna installations. That added a new schedule to the existing license, and in fact, if Ofcom and yourself have been following and focusing on that EMF change, that actually has provided some very useful background to one aspect of the changes in this new license. What's happened, of course, is since most of the text dates back to around 2005, and we're now in 2023, the clearly amateur radio technology and the way the regulators work has changed considerably over that sort of 15 years. So both the amateur community and Ofcom thought it was, relatively timely to review where things were. These things don't happen by accident. So whilst the terms and conditions have been aging a little bit, the area of call sign policy has become more mixed. Some people would say even confused, and it had never been properly consulted on. So Ofcom's using this as an opportunity to reset that policy, not necessarily in a totally welcome way. And this is one area where there may be more concerns than some of the very welcome changes in some of the license conditions. The other area is Ofcom is keen to reduce its workload, and that's partly prompted by the growth in notices of variations, or NOVs. So today, the repeaters, gateways, beacons, I think ETCC, who manage that to some degree for Ofcom, have over 1,000 NOVs in issue. And that's also seen as complicated and showing that the license needs to modernise as well. And there's some personnel and system changes which mean that having a cleaner set of rules with hopefully fewer inquiries will be a benefit of, at least from Ofcom's point of view. So that's the background. It's, as I say, it's just been launched. The other bit of background is, how many radio amateurs and what's involved. So it may surprise someone, but we passed the milestone of over 100 licenses on issue. That obviously includes some people who may have more than one license. So effectively, it's equates to just over 70-odd thousand actual licensed amateurs. The colour chart there shows foundation, intermediate, full, and then there's been an increase in club licensing as well. So as you enter the hobby nowadays, you progress through foundation, intermediate to full, but the very large number of fulls there is in some respects reflecting the CB boom, whereas the 32,000 foundation licenses have arrived since that entry level was introduced in 2001. So there's potentially a lot of people who ought to be interested, and we'd hope a useful proportion of those will take an interest and respond to the consultation. In terms of highlights, here we're going to sort of just briefly go through 4 slides, effectively based on Ofcom's own wording. So there's an element of spin in this, but first of all, they reassure us that the current 3 tiers, foundation, intermediate and full, won't change, but they do want to reduce the need for NOVs. And they do that by incorporating some new changes into the core license. They, depending on when they get their IT modernized, the current online mechanism for revalidation will hopefully be made a little easier. And there's some more interesting changes on here. So today, an amateur can supervise another amateur, but a key change here is that in future, an amateur will be able to directly supervise a guest now, whether that's your wife, a scout, or what have you, under direct supervision, with them holding the microphone, so not just a greeting message facility. And that will be one of the helpful things for introducing amateur radio to new people. The other simplification Ofcom want, which might be slightly more controversial, is if you're holding multiple licenses, foundation, intermediate or full, you'll be required to only surrender you'll be required to surrender the lower licenses. So in general, you would tend to retain your highest license and the other ones would time out. That may be welcome to some people, maybe less welcome to others. That was how it worked in the previous licensing regime, the BR68 regime, actually. So it's not totally unknown, that approach. In terms of other call sign issues, there's a lot of changes here. You can read the slide on screen, but call signs could, if they're surrendered, could be potentially reissued. Whereas in past, in general, once a call sign was used, it was never issued unless, for example, it was a family member trying to re-enable that call. When their IT permits, licensees may be able to change their call sign online. The nature of suffixes, which were already optional, becomes even more optional, I think it's fair to say. And a potentially significant change is that the intermediate calls, which all begin with 2, like 2 echo something or other, for reasons I won't dwell on here, new ones will in future be M8 or M9 series, and existing intermediate licensees will be able to have the relevant M8 or M9 with the 3 letters they already have, so they can adopt that perhaps shorter, more standard format. And slightly more interestingly, the concept of regional secondary locators becomes optional. Now, obviously, amateur radio or DXCC, etc., places great store on those RSLs, and it will be purely down to the amateur community to either use them if they want them, or if they need a shorter or slightly shorter call sign. If you're in a contest and trying to get your QSO rater, well, it'll be optional now. The other thing associated with RSLs is, as we've had recently, you sometimes end up with a special letter for a royal event. And rather than needing a specific NOV that you'd have got from RSGB, there's a new rule being introduced that basically will let a Ofcom notice, so just let you do that if you want. So that simplifies that one. And the NOVs around special event stations, where there was two types of them, the standard ones and the what we're called specials, the GB 100 something or other. They're all going to be merged into one more flexible format in the future as well, so that's probably welcome too. In terms of technical conditions, the headline item is that the standard power or the default power for each of the license classes is going to be increased, but with a few exceptions. So by default, the general 10 watt level for foundation becomes 20, the 50 watt level for intermediates goes to 100, and the 400 watt level for full licensees goes to 1 kilowatt, which I'm sure will please some contest groups. However, there are exceptions, and when you look at the schedule, this only really applies in primary allocations. So where we're secondary and there's another user in the band, you will notice that 400 watts remains, for example. The previous restrictions that meant that foundation and intermediate licensees weren't allowed to use the internet for remote control are swept away, which is welcome modernisation, probably. And in terms of what Ofcom say, the deployment of repeaters, beacons and gateways without requiring an NOV in most cases. I would caution here that there remains a series of technical conditions and a requirement to coordinate and use ETCC for call signs for the mainstream classic repeaters, but certainly for things below 5 watts ERP, that opens up a new set of possibilities, not just for standard things, but for, say, a community or club ad hoc very low power repeater, for example. In terms of foundation, they're now free to fully construct equipments. In the past, that would have required certified kits or modules, for example. So that limitation's been removed, and they're given nominally 1 watt access into 2.4 and 5 gigahertz, where some end enthusiasts may be able to adapt existing commercial modules. The other, quite for the UK, revolutionary item is the ability to operate airborne mobile, aeronautical mobile. Now, this is, needless to say, got some conditions in, not just that half a watt limit, but it's primary bands only, and there's additional conditions very similar to needing the permission on board ship, where you need the captain or the pilot's permission. So whilst these are the headlines, it's well worth reading the actual detail in the document to see the sort of catch or the conditions that go with these. In terms of more general stuff, Ofcom's wording style, I won't say is total plain English, because it's obviously a legal document, but it does lay it out a lot clearer, and some sections like section 10, for example, on unattended, is totally rewritten and split to make that far easier to understand. The Ofcom's approach was to generally try to remove limitations that they didn't see was justified under their sort of latest criteria, I think it's fair to say. And so you can see their own summary, which says that we want to let the hobby continue to develop within a simplified framework. And I'm sure we do too. Right, so that's their highlights. In terms of how they summarize this, within the documents, and we've extracted these 2 tables, there's a lot of fine print, so you might want to study this in your own time. That some of those highlights and some more besides they list, and they categorize them first by, whether it's framework proposals, call signs, or what have you, the different themes, which are the first column, and also whether it is about modernising to provide greater operating freedoms, or simply just clarifying the rules, processes, or English. And of course, that applies to both in many cases. And if I carry on, because this was a long table, you can see there's the technical parameters and the license conditions. And it refers to a few other things that don't make the headlines here. So for example, towards the bottom, you see a reference to when you're traveling abroad, TR 6101, and the way the license looks if you have to show it to a customs officer. Right, in terms of the timing of the process, we mentioned that the consultation launched quite recently. Their deadline is the 4th of September. Changes don't happen on the 5th. Ofcom need their own time to read all the inputs, produce what they call a statement, which is, what the final decision is. And if there may well be changes, if people have commented or people have spotted sort of minor drafting errors that Ofcom may correct. What you then have to wait for is what's known as the notice of variation, which will change your current conditions to the new license terms. Whether they manage that this side of Christmas is sort of a fine run thing, but certainly the safe number is what they call the fourth quarter, which is really the January to March period next year, so perhaps just after Christmas. And indeed, the changes are rolled out in 3 phases. So at the moment, they have to do most of this on their current licensing IT platform, which obviously does have some limitations, but it will allow them to send out that core new set of license terms. In addition, they'll have to obviously then follow up with variations to things like the repeater NOVs and a number of other things. So that really will be part of phase 2, which may be manual or might require minor changes. But things like online license changes or those very long special event stations require the IT to be reprogrammed, or effectively those rules built into the new one. So that's phase 3. And that's not likely to appear until, as it says down in the small print there, in the somewhere in their next financial year, which starts next April. So for some things, it'll come relatively quickly. For other things, it'll be a bit later. And of course, it's not just Ofcom having to do changes. Things like the exam syllabus will be updated to time with that as well. So don't be too concerned about last minute changes. It's being thought about at the moment. In terms of Ofcom's consultation, they ask you a series of questions. Now, I'm not going to go through these line by line. You can see them on the screen. The response document they give you is essentially a Microsoft Word template. That gives you the option of either saying yes or no, but if you have a comment, you can expand on that. And in particular, if you have a concern or an alternative suggestion, do make sure you put something in there. And beware that some of the individual questions actually may be covering more than one topic. So, for example, if we come on to a few questions on here, you can see question 14. Do you agree with our changes to Foundation to build their own equipment, access 2.4 gigs and access 5 gigs? Well, really, that's 3 questions in one. And what you might want to do there, like all these questions, is go back to the paragraph within their document where there may well be a good few paragraphs that give you their reasoning in the context. And if you have a problem with one of those 3 items, for example, do be specific in your answer. Otherwise, they'll just take yeses or silence as acceptance. As we say towards the bottom there, in the tips, the questions may cover multiple topics. The ultimate version of that example is question 17. Do you agree to all the proposed changes in the license T's and C's? Well, when you read round about page 70, now there's a whole sample new license. Some of that will be very good. Some elements or definitions or a few of the things you might want to suggest alternatives in. So take care. I realise reading this may take time, but it's in your interest. And I think, as we said in the introduction, this is the most wide-ranging thing in a generation, and you won't get another opportunity like it for many years either. So now's a great opportunity, but keep it clear and succinct, as we say in that second tip. And finally, do reply by the deadline, and do remember our shortcut on the screen there, where you will be able to see links to this and other guidance. And on that note, I hope these slides and talk help you become aware that it is not just tinkering, it is quite an exercise. And on that note, I'll hand back to David. Thank you.
As Murray has said, both the RSGB and Ofcom encourage every radio amateur to look at the consultation and to respond to Ofcom individually. There's information on the RSGB website at the web address below, and the Society will be adding to it in the coming weeks. Our thanks again to Murray.